Good morning, a small audience. I hope so. The title of my paper is The Trauma in the Future Anterior. In one of Henry James's stories, The Beast in the Jungle, the hero wastes a whole lifetime waiting for something grand to occur in his life. I quote, "Something or other lay in wait for him amid the twists and the turns of the months and the years, like a crouching beast in the jungle." This something, considered to be the real truth about him, overshadows every other event in his life. Near the end of the story, the hero realizes that his life faded away for no purpose at all, as the something that awaited him was there before him all this time. While awaiting something grand to take place, he missed the love that was there. The beast in the jungle was this knowledge that steered within him too late, retrospectively, turning his life into a tragedy. When we say that with Freud the trauma is decided retrospectively, nachträglich, do we also mean to say that trauma, like tragedy, is a way of coming up against a past event, unknown or misunderstood at the time of its occurrence? The tragic turn of events appears to be a way of making sense of events that were incomprehensible while they actually occurred, as if the key to the events that happened was missing and is given too late. Oedipus did not know in real time the identity of the man on the road. Antigone did not realize she was giving up an alliance of love when consecrating a blood alliance. Tragedy is hence a case of symbolic break, where the signifying key is missing. We could say of tragedy that had the hero understood the place of love in his life, he would not have awaited the beast in the jungle. Tragedy demands a retrospective understanding. Yet we cannot say that tragedy affirms an alternative course of events. That is, we would not refer to tragedy with the future anterior. The temporal structure of the future anterior assigns the anticipated course of events a kind of certainty, and this seems unsuitable for explaining tragedy. What turns the course of events into a tragedy is the fact that it negates as unreal the anticipated possibility, as something that never occurred and never could have. Trauma, however, refers to the anticipated course of events retrospectively revealed with certainty, which means that the cause of trauma is a determining cause for the future of events. In trauma, the anticipatory dimension is real. In this talk, I would like to show the implications to be drawn when addressing the question of when does trauma occur with the future anterior. The future anterior was introduced into psychoanalysis by Jacques Lacan, and it suggests a temporality which encapsulates two crucial aspects of trauma. It points to a future anticipated event as anterior, that is sure to occur, and it refers to a cause retrospectively disclosed as real. In order to reveal the psychic implications of this temporal structure, I will show that in trauma, the relation between the events in the future anterior obeys not only logic of anticipation, but also a pattern of repetition. The prior event is a non-identical repetition of the future event, a repetition that implicates the subject of trauma in this temporal structure. So when does trauma occur? The case of trauma paradigmatically associated with the retrospective structure is Freud's case about the woman afraid of entering shops. Freud presents the case in the following way. You have it on the handout, the quote from Freud. Emma is subject at the present time to a compulsion of not being able to go into shops alone. As a reason for this, she produced a memory from the time when she was 12 years old, shortly after puberty. She went into a shop to buy something, saw the two shop assistants one of whom she can remember, laughing together, and ran away in some kind of affect of fright. In connection with this, she was led to recall that the two of them were laughing at her clothes and that one of them had pleased her sexually. Further investigation now revealed a second memory, which she denies having had in mind at the moment of scene 1. Nor is there anything to prove this. On 2 occasions, when she was a child of 8, she had gone into a small shop to buy some sweets, and the shopkeeper had grabbed at her genitals through her clothes. In spite of the first experience, she had gone there a second time. After the second time, she stopped away. She now reproached herself for having gone there the second time, as though she had wanted in that way to provoke the assault. In fact, a state of oppressive bad conscience is to be traced back to this experience. How does Freud invite us to understand the relation between the first and second memory? The later event is the one marking the earlier one as traumatic retrospectively. It is the later event that constitutes the onset of trauma, yet its cause lies at an earlier point. When the prior event reemerges from memory, it illuminates the psychic route along which the subject's life has moved previously and thereafter. Trauma presents a cause retrospectively emerging to indicate the psychic movement essential to the subject. Trauma is not just a retrospective coloring of events in the subject's life course. It is in light of this observation that we can read Lacan's words about time in the unconscious. He says it creates the past in its real form, not as a past that has been abolished, not a past idealized in memory, but a past which manifests itself in an inverted form in repetition. That is, trauma means that a past event is produced as the actual repetition of a later event. When in fact does trauma occur according to Freud? Freud refers to trauma as originally repressed, thus indicating that another event is required in the chain to create trauma. It is puberty for Freud that changes the status of events, thus turning it into the cause of trauma. Freud's idea that trauma is a psychic operation of setting a relation between 2 events may lead to 3 related problems. First, in assuming that trauma occurs at a time which retrospectively sheds a traumatic light on a prior event, we seem to posit trauma as having no definite temporal location. At most, we could say that the trauma occurs in between its actual occurrence, which is in itself untraumatic, and a later event, which is also not traumatic, yet is taken over by the prior event, turning it into a traumatic one. So trauma appears to occur nowhere if we measure it in the absolute terms of linear time. Second, in assuming, this is what is implied in Freud, in assuming trauma is occurring retrospectively, Freud registers trauma twice, once as a libidinally uncharged event and once as sexually charged and hence traumatic. Doesn't this double registration empty trauma from any possible association with the constitutive core, with an actual event? I mean, doesn't it mean that there is no actual event of trauma? For Freud, of course. The third problem is that the idea of retrospective registration seems to support the Freudian idea that the unconscious does not admit of temporal differences. It knows no difference of past, present, and future. Future demands to be taken as constituting a temporal dimension, as it appears to posit a different psychic or subjectivized temporal register, thus removing trauma from real temporality. These problematic implications drawn from Freud's analysis may mistakenly suggest that for psychoanalysis, trauma is a strictly mental event, having no underpinnings in reality. that for psychoanalysis, the reality of the unconscious is disconnected from considerations of real truth. However, we may take Freud's own terms of the nachträglich to imply that trauma requires a notion of temporality constituted by the subject's psychic movement in real events. To clarify this point, I would like to refer to the way Heidegger approaches past, present, and future. The structure of past, present, and future times already belongs to Dasein's. Dasein is Heidegger's idea of the human subject, indicating the ways of involvement of Dasein in his world. Away from the ordinary conception of temporality, Heidegger claims that the before and the ahead indicate the future as of a sort which would make it possible for Dasein to be such that its potentiality for being is an issue. The future is being for the sake of itself. The present is that in the face of which Dasein has been thrown into its world. And the past is what has been and to which Dasein has been abandoned. So the times are not measurable moments along an absolute time sequence, but a way of temporalizing the world in which Dasein temporalizes itself. The temporality of past and future indicates how Dasein is not in time, but steps forth into time, existing in the world. Existing in the world, not being in the world, but being outside it and inside it at the same time. Let us go back to the future anterior. A grammatical tense which refers to an event or action in the future that will be completed by a time another future event occurs. By the time, an example, by the time they are inside the hall, the bomb will have exploded. The future anterior means that the explosion will occur while the gathering in the hall is already complete. At the time of utterance, it is not determined yet whether the bomb will actually explode, but the anticipation of the explosion turns the gathering into a determining cause. The peculiar structure of future anterior also implies that the prior event turns out to be determined by the anticipated event. We cannot say it is certain the bomb will explode, since the explosion is in the future tense, but the reference to the past guarantees that from the point of view of the prior event being complete, the explosion can be anticipated with certainty. There is a certainty, a real weight to the event assigned by the will have been as an event anticipated, but not to be confirmed until a future moment. The future anterior thus establishes two grammatical moments, yet its meaning leans on the crossing of the one by the other. The two events do not merge, but they are related in an impossible relation of anticipation of something uncertain in the future, made past and certain by introduction of its cause. Furthermore, the events do not simply condition each other. The later event turns out to repeat something already there in the first event, and to be repeated in it. What they repeat, I will claim, is the subject's ownmost being as cause, to be repeated in the anticipated traumatic turn of events. But what kind of reality can we ascribe to an event predicated as belonging to the future anterior? I will use as an example Tarantino's film *Inglourious Bastards*. I hope you all know it. It can illustrate the certainty involved in an event of the future anterior. In other words, it can clarify how a future event affects us as real. Does not this film establish a whole reality in the future anterior by supplying the cause that was missing from actual history? Doesn't the film provide an anticipated future that determines the reality of an event prior to it, thus creating a real history at another register? I remember reading in the daily papers at the time the film was already shown here, that Holocaust survivors went to watch this film several times. I take this piece of information as confirming the idea that Tarantino's film is not a fantasy, nor a story about a virtual reality. His act of genius is to describe anticipated events in the future anterior, that is, as what must have been had another event been completed by that time. This is the future as anticipated by an event that counteracts the Nazi infinite bestiality with revenge. The film shows us the certainty of a future in which the Nazis' actions are avenged. When the cinema hall is fully crowded, that bomb will have exploded, killing all the Nazis inside. Tarantino's example can show us that the anticipated event gains a reality once a condition has been fulfilled. Tarantino hence succeeds to describe history as it should have been, rather than as it could have been. This is the meaning of the future anterior, establishing the reality of trauma in an event that anticipates what is to come in the subject's life. The future anterior thus tells us that the temporality of the trauma is not a floating temporality of an unlocatable event. The temporality of trauma involves the anticipation created by an event that sets on the history of the subject, thus turning this history into a real enactment of the prior event revealed to be a cause. Trauma is not a chain of nows or a change in the status of the mental. Trauma obeys a temporality in which the subject's real being determines the past, the present, and the future in history. So with trauma, we deal with a temporality of past, present, and future moments whose relation is established by the subject's own being in time. We can clarify this matter with the example of love given by Jacques-Alain Miller in connection with the erotic of time. He says, love repeats the contingent future by recording time and again the encounter that could have not occurred by saying, we were destined to each other. That is, for the subject being in love, the contingent future affirms a necessary past event which assigns a measure of certainty to that future. The future of the love relation turns out to be a necessary repetition of a past already decided as faithful. I quote from Lacan, one of his papers, I identify myself in language, but only by losing myself in it as an object. What is realized in my history is neither the past definite as what was, since it is no more, nor even the perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given what I am in the process of becoming. Lacan, like Heidegger, teaches us the idea of being in time, that the future anterior exhibits and encapsulates the idea of temporality as what defines the time in which the speaking being is. The quote from Lacan also reveals that it is the anticipated future that most authentically related to the subject being. The future anterior is the time, the temporality most authentically related to the subject. Both Lacan and Heidegger give priority to the future in this respect. And I quote again from Heidegger, Being and Time, the existential temporal condition for the possibility of the world lies in the fact that temporality has something like a horizon, a whither, to which one is carried away. The history of the subject has a limit defined as his death, not death as the objective point terminating one's life, but as that possibility which is the subject's own most, which is unconditional, unsurpassable, certain, and as such indeterminable. The subject being understood as defined by his historicity. Being toward this is a quote from Heidegger by Lacan. Being toward death indicates a limit present at every instant of the subject history, in every moment already finished of this history. This is the past in its real form, not as a past that has been abolished, not a past idealized in memory, but a past which manifests itself in an inverted form in repetition. The idea of anticipation and the priority of the future in the structure of temporality as the structure most authentic of the subject's being is what completes the picture provided by the future anterior. The temporality of trauma involves the subject being in the world and not the world per se. The past of the subject is the past repeated in the anticipation of the limit of this history. It is the limit towards which history moves, thus negating any possibility of repeating the same. Thus in trauma, repetition is never repetition of the same, and yet repetition indicates that the past of the subject is where an inversion of the past into the future has taken place. The future anterior realizes the history of the subject in language as anticipating its limit, as what the subject will have been given what he is in the process of becoming, to use Lacan's formulation. That is, trauma occurs in the future anterior in the sense that it makes time for what is the subject's almost unconditioned being. It is in an anticipated future that the subject historicity is manifested in time. At the moment the woman walks into the shop in which you will see a shopkeeper looking at her clothes, a past moment will become a determining event anticipating future moments. The past moment would have been forgotten forever in another subject, could have eluded its function as cause. But for this particular subject, the moment she steps into the shop becomes a determining moment for her history as an anticipation, determined in relation to her innermost, onmost being. The woman being in time is what will turn the past event into a repetition. The later event will be repeated in a moment, already past, setting forth the subject's relation to the real time of her trauma. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Time is now for question for 5 minutes. Okay.
I'm so glad that I came. It's so relevant for what I'm doing, also what I tried to talk about. What I tried to talk about yesterday a little bit. I just have 2 quick questions that'll help me, but maybe to clarify the complexity of temporality. You talked about an anticipatory element. But on the other hand, in my understanding of Freud, it's precisely this idea that there is no preparation that is part of what causes trauma. For example, beyond the pleasure principle, not so much in Emma, but later on, formulations of trauma. That there's no preparation, and so there's no defense in a way. It's a question of causality. If I understand Emma correctly, also, it's not that the first event caused the second event. It's not linear causality, it's the opposite, if anything, right? The second event sort of causes the first event to become trauma. So is this the same thing, or are we saying the same thing, and the second point or question is that the Emma cases before Freud made this shift to say that sometimes it's a fantasy and not a real event. Does that make a difference here? Nachtraglichkeit also is something that's used beyond trauma. It's a structure that we see in Freud in a lot of instances, even not in trauma. So how does that relate to this?
To a metal stick.
It's too short.
Okay.
No?
Well, I can stand up. It doesn't matter. the idea of anticipation or the future anterior is a way to complete the Nachträglich with Lacan's notion of anticipation. I think that it, in a way, transforms or makes a somewhat significant modification of Freud, in the sense that surely you can't say that the prior event is a cause of a later event. That's why the repetition is reversed in order. That is, the notion of anticipation means that the first event creates an anticipation for another event, when the second event will occur in a way which is related to the core of the subject. It will turn the prior event into a cause. I think this is what anticipation modifies in our understanding of the Nachträglich in Freud. I hope it answers more or less what you're asking.
It's different.
It's not anticipation before. Retrospectively, it becomes anticipation.
No, the first scene creates an anticipation. Now, in a way, it doesn't have to be completed in the future event. In a way, let's say the first scene could divert into other sequences or other possible courses of events. For this particular subject, when the second event occurs, it turns the first one into a cause.
That part is clear. I'm just talking about the anticipation. The first event in and of itself separately causes an anticipation.
The first event makes the second event an anticipated one. In a way, the second event is imbued in the first event, but not necessarily so. It will turn this way only in relation to this particular subject. So in a way we can say that there are two events, but because of the notion of anticipation, they are not separated events. They are linked in a certain way. How are they linked? They are linked. Let's say that the logic of the link is provided by the idea of the future anterior. The psyche of the link is provided by the idea of being in time.
It's in the beginning when you were problematizing the temporality of trauma. I don't need a microphone. Okay. You actually said, I don't know if it was by mistake, but it really interested me. You said, so in fact the trauma occurred nowhere, and you moved into a spatial dimension. And I'm wondering if there's some relation to that, if it just was a slip of tongue, or if we can't really imagine these temporal moments without actually also thinking about time and some kind of space between them.
I refer to the fact that the trauma occurs nowhere in connection to the problems that can be implied in Freud's analysis of trauma. The problem is how do we locate the event of trauma when, in a way, we can say that following Freud, it is not located anywhere. I didn't mean to refer to the speciality of time in this particular context, but in principle, I do think that the psychoanalytic analysis of trauma is a way of making place or making time for trauma. And making time is, in a way, it's a space-time. It's not a time per se. So I don't know. This is actually a later idea of Heidegger, that temporality is in fact has to be thought in spatial terms, and I think this is also a direction that can be developed, because I think it's very relevant to the way trauma should be temporalized.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one is to make a connection between this lecture and your work on possible words, if it's possible, because I think there is a link. And the second one is more precise. Could you lighten a little more for me? What is the connection between your trauma analysis, and I perfectly agree with that. It seems to me very, very, very relevant, and a counterfactual as the film of Tarantino is. Because, in my view, it's not the same thing logically. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I want the light about this.
You say that Tarantino's is a counterfactual and not a future, and not something in the future anterior?
Yeah.
Why can't you describe the temporality of the counterfactual in terms of the future anterior?
You said
the idea of the counterfactual is a way to treat realistically a different world. I mean, to assign realism to another possibility, which is more or less what I'm, let's say, modalically speaking, that's more or less what I'm saying about Tarantino, that it is not a film about a virtual reality or a fantasy. It describes a real possibility, which is another way of saying that it is a counterfactual that under certain definitions.
That's the question.
I thought that the same point, because perhaps it's not describing a reality, but it's simulating the fictional basis and possibility of reality. That's another level, I think, because it's how would you put it? We are not. That's not a film describing a trauma or the process of building up a trauma by the future anterior. It's not this film about that, because the people going to the cinema are 60 years later going to the cinema. So we are not witnessing first experience and then after that second experience, which turns the past into something. So we are experiencing the film using this background that there is in society and even in culture, this sort of experience, traumatic experience of the Holocaust, as to play fictionally some alternative, but in doing so using exactly the structure. So it is very cleverly made, some sort of futur antérieur used as fictional material. It's on another level, I think. And so, to a certain extent, you're right, I think, it's playing with this sort of futur antérieur, at the same time using it as to do fiction, to do something, oh, that would have been lovely. You know, revenge, that would have been.
I think if it just...
But there's history, because history shows, it can be proven that it went another way. That's the point. And then the leap into fiction helps us all to indulge and to cherish the futur antérieur as a fiction. That it would have been different. Would have been different.
Tarantino wasn't an example for how history can be rectified by the notion of anticipation, but I think that if it was simply a way of dramatizing that history could have been different, Holocaust survivors wouldn't have gone so many times to watch it. So what I mean is that I took this example to show to what extent the futur antérieur assigns an actuality to an anticipated event that didn't take place. So let's say I think that the idea of the difference here between fiction and non-fiction is of no importance. In a way, the anticipatory moment makes the history as it should have been, but of course it wasn't. It didn't run this way. Then it turns the history as it should have been as something that has a kind of certainty that a Holocaust survivor maybe can experience a kind of catharsis. Otherwise, you would want to watch, I don't know, a Hollywood film or something about Lord of the Rings and not about an alternative Holocaust history. So this is the idea is really to show what kind of actuality or certainty is assigned to the future anterior. That is not. It's not a way of. It's not a possibility of this of the kind that we usually think about alternative worlds. But it's an intricate question. Yeah.